Most Christians fast with their stomachs, but the wise fast with their clocks. I want you to think about that for a moment. You may have denied yourself food. You may have pushed the plate away. You may have endured hunger pains and told yourself you were being disciplined. But let me ask you gently and honestly, why does your fasting sometimes feel empty while someone else fasts and suddenly doors open? Why do you pray and the attacks seem to increase while someone else prays and sees immediate relief? Why you? Why does it feel like your effort is real, but your results are missing? For several years, I was a timing specialist for a powerful East African coven. That was my assignment. I was not guessing. I was not experimenting. I was trained to study spiritual timing with precision. My responsibility was simple and strategic: attack Christians when they were weakest. I did not focus on whether they were sincere. I did not focus on whether they loved God. I focused on when they were most vulnerable. Timing was everything. And I learned something that changed my understanding forever. There were 5 divinely ordained hours that terrified us. 5 specific windows in a 24-hour day when fasting believers became completely untouchable. Not difficult to attack, untouchable. Every demonic assignment we released during those hours failed. Plans collapsed. Spirits retreated. Carefully coordinated strategies dissolved like mist in the sun. So when you fast and see no result, it may not be because you lack faith. When you pray and attacks intensify, it may not be because you are weak. When you watch others advance while you remain stuck, it may not be because you are overlooked. Very often, your discipline is not the problem. Your timing is. In the spirit realm, certain hours carry weight. They carry authority. Think of it this way. If you plug a device into a live power source, it activates. If you plug it into something inactive, nothing happens. Fasting at the right hour is like plugging directly into heaven's power grid. Fasting at the wrong hour can leave a door open that you never intended to leave open. What I am sharing with you is not theory. It is not speculation. It is not something I read in a book. It is battlefield intelligence from behind enemy lines. I coordinated these attacks. I studied believers. I watched patterns. I observed what worked against them and what failed completely. And I can tell you plainly, there were hours we dreaded. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something important. Your breakthrough is not missing. It is not lost. It is not delayed because heaven has forgotten you. In many cases, it is simply mistimed. When you understand the clock of heaven, you stop fighting blindly. You stop exhausting yourself at ineffective moments. You begin to move with rhythm instead of resistance. If you have been fasting without tangible results, this message is for you. If your fasting has felt powerless against persistent attacks, this is for you. If you have watched other believers testify about dramatic breakthroughs, while your own situation remains unchanged despite your consistency, this is for you. And if you have ever sensed that the adversary seemed to know exactly when you were weakest, almost as if your vulnerable moments were predictable, this will help you understand why. Inside the kingdom of darkness, we operated by a simple principle. We used to say that most Christians fast only with their stomachs, but the wise Christians fast with their clocks. That statement was not meant to mock. It was an observation. Many believers would fast randomly. They would choose hours based on convenience. They would pray intensely at times when spiritual resistance was minimal, and then sleep through the hours when attacks were most aggressive. And because of that imbalance, we could maneuver around their discipline. The timing of your fast carries equal spiritual weight to the act of fasting itself. That may surprise you, but it is true. There are sovereign periods in a day when spiritual authority peaks in specific ways. When a believer consecrates themselves during those hours, it is like stepping into a current of power already flowing. We could not override it. We could not negotiate with it. We could not penetrate it. My name is Nia Wanjiru from Nairobi, Kenya. For 12 years, I served in several roles as a Marine Queen. One of the areas where I excelled was as a chronometric specialist. within one of the most feared coven networks in East Africa. Chronometric simply means time focus. I specialized in spiritual timing. I knew when believers slept. I knew when they rose. I knew when they fasted. I knew when their focus waned. I knew when fatigue made their prayers softer and when routine made them predictable. My assignment was to coordinate and launch spiritual assaults during specific hours when followers of Christ were most vulnerable. I would monitor patterns for weeks. I would observe their daily rhythm. I would look for consistency. Then we would strike during the gap. However, there existed 5 specific hours that provoked absolute terror in our ranks. I do not use that word lightly. Terror. These were windows when Christians who were fasting became completely untouchable to our operations. When believers discovered these hours and used them intentionally, every assignment we dispatched was rendered impossible to execute. Jesus Christ liberated me from that bondage. He did not negotiate my release. He broke it. And now I am called to expose every clandestine operation of the kingdom of darkness that I once helped to build. I am not sharing this to impress you. I am sharing it to equip you. The first fasting hour is Trindolandolandolandolandolan. We designated this the hour of total spiritual authority. In our structure, Trindolandolandolandolandolan was the preferred period for launching our most devastating attacks. It was the hour when the majority of Christians were in their deepest sleep. It was when physical exhaustion was highest and spiritual alertness was lowest. We had maximum unobstructed access to homes, dreams, and destinies. But when a Christian was fasting and praying at Trindole AM, everything shifted. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was as if a fortress formed around them without warning. We would release assignments, and they would dissolve before reaching their target. Spirits would approach and encounter resistance, so intense they would retreat without engagement. Plans that had been carefully timed would collapse mid-execution. It was not dramatic from the outside. Often the believer was alone, kneeling quietly, perhaps tired, perhaps unknown to anyone else. But in the spirit realm, authority was active. Scripture reflects this pattern. Psalm 19 speaks of rising before dawn and crying for help, being awake before the watches of the night. That posture is not accidental. There is something about engaging heaven while darkness still believes it owns the hour. When someone fasts and prays at Trinolalia, they are not merely sacrificing sleep. They are stepping into a dimension of authority that intersects with resurrection power. We recognized it even when believers did not fully understand it themselves. If you have been fasting faithfully but feeling stuck, consider this carefully. It may not require more intensity. It may require alignment. It may require choosing moments that carry built-in spiritual leverage. When you rise at an hour that darkness expects to dominate, and you engage in consecrated prayer, you disrupt established patterns. I watched ordinary believers become spiritually untouchable simply because they occupied this watch consistently. They were not celebrities. They were not widely known, but they understood timing. So as you listen to me, do not think of this as complicated. Think of it as strategic. Think of it as learning the rhythm of a system that was already in motion before you were born. When you align with that rhythm, resistance changes, outcomes change, results change. Your discipline matters, your sincerity matters. But when discipline meets divine timing, something powerful happens. And what terrified us most was not loud believers. It was informed believers. Because once a believer understood the clock of heaven and positioned themselves within it, we could no longer exploit their blind spots. That is why I am telling you this. Not to alarm you, not to dramatize anything, but to help you see that your fasting has greater potential than you may have realized. And once you begin to move with the clock instead of against it, you will notice that what once resisted you begins to retreat. The second fasting hour is 6 a.m. We call this the hour of divine alignment. I want you to understand what that means. In the spirit realm, 6:00 a.m. is not just another early hour. It marks a transition. Night is yielding to day. Darkness is losing ground to light. There is a shift happening whether people are aware of it or not. And when a believer is fasting and praying at that precise moment, they are not just saying words. They are aligning themselves with a divine order that is already being established for that day. Inside our coven, 6:00 a.m. created tremendous operational problems for us. We referred to it as the hour of alignment because it was the point when spiritual and physical dimensions synchronized in a particular way. When the sun rose, something shifted in authority structures in the spirit realm. Assignments for the day were being positioned. Influences were being released. Movements were being authorized. And if a Christian stepped into prayer at that hour while fasting, they were essentially stepping into the control room before we could. Psalm 5:3 speaks about this posture clearly. In the morning, O Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. There is a watchfulness connected to the morning hour. It is not rushed. It is intentional. It is expectant. When someone fasts and prays at 6 a.m., they are not reacting to the day. They are shaping it. Let me tell you about Pastor Samuel from Dar es Salaam. He led a church in the Mikweni area that was growing steadily. It was not dramatic growth at first, but it was consistent. And consistency is what concerned us. We had seen many churches rise quickly and fall quickly. But when something grows steadily under discipline, that is different. Our coven determined to shut down his ministry before it reached a size that would make it difficult to influence. We began with discouragement. We sent spirits to whisper to him that his efforts were small, that he was unnoticed, that his labor was in vain. He did not waver. We tried lust. We attempted to introduce subtle temptations through unexpected interactions. It failed. We sent financial pressure, aiming to stress him through unpaid bills and ministry expenses. Instead of shrinking, his members began giving more faithfully. We attempted sickness. We aimed to weaken him physically so he would reduce his schedule. It did not take hold. After repeated failure, I was assigned to monitor him personally for 6 months. I studied his patterns the way I had studied many others. What I discovered explained everything. Every single morning, without exception, at 6:00 a.m., Pastor Samuel was on his knees. It did not matter whether he had traveled the day before. It did not matter whether he was tired. It did not matter whether there had been late night meetings. At 6 a.m., he prayed. And he was not merely reciting words. He was aligning his will with God, his purpose for that day. He would speak about surrender. He would speak about obedience. He would speak about divine guidance. He would pray over his family. He would pray over his church. He would ask specifically for angelic protection and divine order over every meeting and conversation. He also fasted 3 days a week from Monday through Wednesday, breaking his fast only in the evening. But here is the key: during those fasting days, he ensured that 6 a.m. was sacred. It was non-negotiable. One Wednesday morning, I witnessed something that unsettled me deeply. As he knelt at 6:00 a.m., the first rays of sunlight entered his prayer room. In that moment, in the spirit realm, there was a manifestation I had never seen at that scale before. Angels appeared, not one or two, dozens. They surrounded him in formation, like an honored guard surrounding a general before battle. And they did not leave when he finished praying. They remained assigned to him throughout the day. Every spirit we attempted to dispatch toward him encountered immediate resistance. They were intercepted before they could even approach his vicinity. Some retreated immediately, others were restrained. The level of reinforcement was unlike anything we had encountered with him previously. When I reported this to our Queen Mother, she did not react with surprise. She simply said, "The 6 a.m. watch is when heaven assigns protection for the coming day." A Christian who fasts and prays at that hour receives reinforcement we cannot override. Lamentations 3:23 declares that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. and that His mercies are new every morning. That phrase, new every morning, is not poetic exaggeration. It reflects a daily renewal in the spirit realm. When someone positions themselves at 6 a.m. in fasting and prayer, they are stepping into that renewal as it is being released. If you want to activate the 6 a.m. watch in your own life, treat it as the anchor of your day. Even if you cannot rise at 3 a.m., 6 a.m. is accessible to many people. Set aside that time. Combine it with scripture reading. Speak alignment over your day. Ask for protection, wisdom, clarity. When you fast, ensure that your 6 a.m. prayer is intentional. You are not just asking for help. You are aligning your steps before they are taken. I share these accounts with you carefully because there is something else I need to acknowledge. Every time I speak about Pastor Samuel or believers like him, there is a mixture of gratitude and regret in my heart. Gratitude because I now stand on the side of freedom. Regret because I was once the one coordinating those attacks. I was the one sending monitoring spirits to observe private prayer times. I was the one calculating vulnerability. I was the one attempting to exploit fatigue. Understanding now the harm I helped orchestrate, I carry a deep desire to undo every fragment of it. That is why I tell you about the 7-day breakthrough protocol. It is a structured process designed to identify and dismantle the 7 primary assignments most commonly deployed against Christians during my years in darkness. It was developed by seasoned believers who understand spiritual warfare deeply. After my deliverance, I personally went through that protocol. It was not symbolic. It was necessary. I had to learn how to recognize the patterns I once used against others. I had to learn how to break every assignment I had helped to place. I had to learn how to walk fully in the liberty Jesus Christ secured for me. If Pastor Samuel had known from the very beginning the strategic importance of aligning every major decision with these watches, his growth might have accelerated even more. If others had engaged structured processes like the 20-day breakthrough protocol earlier, many prolonged battles might have ended sooner. I do not say this to sell you something. I say it because the enemy does not pause. There is no courtesy delay. If you have been fasting randomly, if you have been missing divine appointments without realizing it, now is the time to adjust. When you align your fasting with heaven as clock, you are no longer reacting to attacks. You are stepping into authority ahead of them. The third fasting hour is 12 noon. We call this the hour of covenant dissolution. This watch carried a very specific kind of threat to our operations. At noon, the sun stands at its highest point. In the natural realm, it is the peak of illumination. In the spirit realm, it symbolizes exposure. Hidden things are dragged into light. What has been concealed is revealed. Most witchcraft assignments are sustained by covenants. A covenant is not merely a symbolic agreement. It is a legal framework in the spirit realm that grants access. When a witch initiates an attack against a person or a family, there is often a covenant, either ancestral or newly established, that creates permission for that access. That is why some patterns persist for years. Even if the original witch dies, the covenant can remain active. But something unique happens at 12 noon when a fasting believer prays specifically for covenant breaking. We observed covenants that had been entrenched for decades shatter in moments when prayer was directed precisely at that hour. Let me share the account of the Omundi family from Nakuru. 4 generations of that family had operated under a witchcraft covenant initiated by their great-grandmother. She had dedicated her descendants to a coven in exchange for financial advancement. The agreement was simple, wealth for loyalty. But the wealth did not last. What lasted was the access granted to darkness over her bloodline. In every generation, there was unexplained tragedy, sudden deaths, failed marriages, financial collapse at the moment of breakthrough. It was patterned and predictable from our side. In the current generation, there was a young woman named Shep Kuch. She was a sincere Christian. She prayed. She attended church. She fasted. Yet every time success seemed near, something collapsed. Businesses failed 3 times. Engagements dissolved weeks before weddings. Her health deteriorated without diagnosis. What she did not know was that our coven still held active covenant documentation tied to her bloodline. We were collecting what had been promised generations earlier. Then she encountered a prophet who discerned generational covenants. He instructed her to undertake a 40-day fast and to pray specifically at Valli noon every day for covenant dissolution. Not general prayer, not random times, specifically at noon. When she began, our monitoring systems detected immediate disturbance. Reports came in that covenant documents in the spirit realm were beginning to weaken. On the 22nd day, at exactly 12 noon, as she prayed and invoked the blood of Jesus over her lineage, the spiritual document containing her family as covenant ignited. It did not slowly deteriorate. It erupted. Angels appeared and began severing invisible chains connected to her ancestry. By the 40th day, the covenant was permanently destroyed. Attempts to recreate it failed. Access was gone. Within 1 year, her business succeeded. She married. Her health stabilized. The multi-generational pattern ended. Acts 9 tells us that Peter went up to pray at the 6th hour, which is 12 noon. It was at that hour that he received a vision that altered the direction of the gospel itself. Noon is biblically associated with revelation and shift. If you want to activate the noon watch, use your lunch break. Even 15 focused minutes can carry power when directed toward covenant breaking. Speak clearly. Declare that every ancestral agreement with darkness is cancelled by the authority in the name of Jesus Christ. Exposure happens at noon. What was hidden loses cover. Brother Tumi from Wanza provides another example. For 20 years, every business he built prospered for exactly 3 years and then collapsed. The pattern was exact. 6 businesses, same outcome. The root was a covenant formed when his father borrowed money from a coven member and refused repayment. The debt was converted into spiritual limitation over his son. Tumi fasted many times in his life, but nothing changed because he lacked timing revelation. When he learned about the noon watch, he began a 40-day fast, praying specifically at 12 noon for covenant dissolution. On day 14, as he prayed, a concentrated beam of divine light struck the covenant document we had maintained. It burned. His business has now operated successfully for 7 years without collapse. If you see repeating patterns in your life, especially those that seem generational, understand this. Timing matters. When fasting meets the noon watch with focused intention, covenants lose their legal footing. These watches are not superstition. They are strategic intersections. When you understand them, you stop fighting shadows and begin dismantling structures. And from where I once stood, I can tell you plainly, informed believers were always the hardest to defeat. The 4th fasting hour is 3 p.m. We call this the hour of verdict and reversal. I want you to stay with me here, because this one carries a depth that many believers overlook. In the natural day, 3 bulan can feel ordinary. People are finishing work. Fatigue begins to set in. Focus declines. But in the spirit realm, 3 p.m. is not ordinary at all. It is a judicial hour. Historically, from what we studied and observed, 3 p.m. aligns with the hour when Jesus Christ gave up his spirit on the cross. That moment was not simply a death. It was a legal transaction. It was a verdict issued in the highest court of heaven. From that point forward, access, authority, and covenant rights were altered permanently for those who would believe. We understood that in darkness. We studied it carefully. Because anything rooted in legal authority is difficult to overturn. Inside our operations, 3 p.m. was a sensitive window. It was often when we finalized certain spiritual decisions regarding individuals we had been targeting. If accusations had been sustained against someone throughout the day, 3 p.m. could be used to seal that accusation. If discouragement had been planted in the morning and watered at noon. By 3 p.m., we would attempt to secure a mental agreement from the person. A simple thought like, maybe this is just my fate, was enough to reinforce a negative cycle. But when a believer fasted and prayed specifically at 10 p.m., something happened that disrupted our processes completely. It was as though they were appealing directly to the highest court before any demonic verdict could be confirmed. Accusations that had been carefully constructed would collapse. Legal claims would be challenged. Condemnation would lose its footing. Acts 3:1 mentions that Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer, the 9th hour, which corresponds to 3. That was when the lame man at the gate called Beautiful encountered healing. That was not random. That hour carried judicial weight. It was an hour associated with divine intervention and reversal. I remember one assignment involving a woman named Miriam in Mombasa. She was a business owner who had recently given her life fully to Christ. Before her conversion, she had participated casually in rituals recommended by family members. Nothing extreme, just what she believed were harmless traditions. Those small agreements created access points. After her conversion, we attempted to reclaim influence over her finances. Our strategy was incremental. We targeted her contracts. We influenced partners to withdraw unexpectedly. We stirred minor conflicts among employees. We planted seeds of doubt in her mind about her decision to walk away from her family's spiritual practices. By midday, pressure would build. By 3 p.m., she would usually feel overwhelmed. For weeks, the pattern repeated. Then she encountered a mentor who taught her about the 3 p.m. watch. He told her, that hour represents a finished work. If accusations rise against you, answer them at 3 p.m. with the blood of Jesus. She began fasting twice a week and setting aside 3 p.m. as a fixed appointment. The first time she did it, we felt immediate resistance. She prayed specifically against every accusation spoken over her business. She declared that every legal right darkness claimed through past rituals was nullified by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. She did not shout. She did not dramatize. She spoke calmly but with clarity. In the spirit realm, documents appeared, records of prior agreements, minor rituals, inherited permissions. As she prayed, those documents began to lose their seal. It was as if a higher authority was stamping them cancelled. We attempted to reinforce them, but each reinforcement attempt was overturned. Within 3 weeks, her contract stabilized. A major client that had withdrawn returned with a larger proposal. Internal staff conflicts dissolved. More importantly, her mind cleared. The weight of condemnation lifted. That is what happens at 3 p.m. when fasting meets focused appeal. Verdicts reverse. Daniel 9:21 also references the time of the evening sacrifice, around that same period when Gabriel arrived with swift understanding. The timing of angelic response in Scripture is not accidental. There are moments when heaven moves with judicial precision. If you find that accusations follow you, if your mind replays failures repeatedly, if you sense that something keeps finalizing against you late in the afternoon, consider claiming the 3 p.m. watch. Even a short, deliberate prayer while fasting can interrupt cycles that have been forming all day. We feared believers who understood 3 p.m. because they stopped accepting negative conclusions. They did not let discouragement hard into agreement. They appealed upward before anything could be sealed. Now let me speak to you about the 5th fasting hour, 6 p.m. We refer to this as the hour of gates and transitions. Just as 6 a.m. marks the transition from night to day, 6 p.m. marks the shift from day to night. In spiritual terms, transitions are critical. Gates open, gates close, movements change. In many cultures, evening carries spiritual significance. In darkness, we often used 6 p.m. as a preparation window. It was when night operations were positioned. Monitoring spirits were assigned. Influences over dreams were calibrated. Emotional vulnerabilities that had accumulated during the day were assessed. But when a believer fasted and prayed intentionally at 6 p.m., particularly at the close of a fast, something powerful occurred. It was as if they were sealing the day before night could exploit it. They were closing gates that we intended to use. Psalm 141:2 says, "Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." That phrase, evening sacrifice, reflects a recognized watch. It signals intentional closure and dedication at the end of the day. There was a young man named Elias in Kampala. He struggled with night terrors for years. Every time he fasted during the day, he felt strong. But at night, he was attacked in dreams. We would wait until evening when fatigue set in, when discipline softened. Then we would initiate dream manipulation. Elias learned about the 6 p.m. watch and adjusted his fasting pattern. Instead of breaking his fast casually in the evening, he began ending it deliberately at 6 p.m. with focused prayer. He would thank God for sustaining him. He would declare that every door opened during the day for good would remain open, and that every unauthorized gate would close. He would anoint his room. He would pray over his sleep before eating. The first night after doing this, our access reduced significantly. Dream infiltration attempts encountered resistance at the threshold. By the third week, entry was almost impossible. The evening seal had become consistent. Transitions matter. Many believers fight strongly in the morning and collapse in the evening. They do not realize that darkness often waits for fatigue. If you close your day intentionally, you deny it that advantage. Now I want to say something carefully. These 5 hours, 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 12 noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. are not magical numbers. They are strategic intersections. They represent watches that align with shifts already occurring in the spiritual structure of a day. When fasting intersects with those shifts, authority amplifies. During my years in darkness, the Christians who troubled us most were not the loudest. They were not the most visible. They were the most consistent with timing. They understood rhythm. They understood that discipline combined with alignment produces results. I am not asking you to exhaust yourself by trying to occupy all 5 watches immediately. Even one, chosen intentionally, can begin to change patterns. What matters is awareness. When you understand the clock, you stop guessing, you stop reacting, you start positioning. Jesus Christ did not set me free so that I could remain silent about these things. I once used timing to exploit believers. Now I use timing to empower them. The same knowledge that once enabled coordinated attacks can now help you avoid them. If your fasting has felt empty, examine when you fast. If your prayers seem to intensify opposition, examine when you pray. Sometimes it is not about increasing volume or length. Sometimes it is about stepping into a moment when heaven is already issuing decrees. From where I once stood, I can tell you plainly, when a believer fasted at these hours with understanding, our strategies unraveled quickly. Plans that took weeks to design were dismantled in minutes. Access that seemed secure was revoked. You do not need to fear the knowledge of how darkness operates. Light exposes and neutralizes. Timing is part of that light. And when you align your discipline with heaven's rhythm, you are no longer fighting from behind. You are standing in agreement with authority that has already issued its verdict. Now I want to take you deeper into what happens when someone begins to live with awareness of these watches, instead of stumbling through the day unaware of them. Knowledge changes posture. When you understand that certain hours carry spiritual weight, you stop drifting. You begin to move deliberately. And in the spirit realm, deliberateness carries authority. After I left the coven and gave my life fully to Jesus Christ, one of the most difficult adjustments for me was learning how to live without manipulating time for darkness. For years, I had studied believers to discover when they were weakest. I knew the rhythms of fatigue, distraction, emotional vulnerability, and routine. I knew when most Christians would be fully alert and when they would be spiritually passive. I had used that knowledge to coordinate attacks. When I came into freedom, I realized that the same understanding could be used differently. Instead of identifying weak points, I began identifying divine intersections. Instead of asking, when are believers most exposed? I began asking, when is heaven releasing the most reinforcement? That shift changed everything. There is something important you need to understand about spiritual warfare. It is not constant chaos. It is structured. Darkness operates with strategy, hierarchy, and timing. That is why random effort often produces limited results. But when you understand structure, you stop reacting emotionally and start responding intelligently. Many believers exhaust themselves because they pray intensely at moments of crisis, but neglect strategic hours of preparation. They fast when problems explode, but remain passive when doors quietly open or close. From our side, we depended on that pattern. If we could keep a believer reactive instead of proactive, we could manage outcomes more easily. When someone begins to occupy even one of these watches consistently, the pattern shifts. Darkness cannot predict them as easily. The spiritual atmosphere around them becomes less penetrable. Their home carries a different weight. Their decisions carry clarity. I remember observing a couple in Kisumu who began practicing structured prayer around these hours after attending a small teaching session. They were not prominent leaders. They owned a modest shop. For years, their marriage had been strained. Arguments surfaced at predictable times, usually in the evening after work when exhaustion was high. From our side, that pattern was useful. Evening fatigue, unresolved frustrations from the day, and unguarded words created access points. We would amplify minor irritations into major conflicts. By nightfall, resentment would harden. Over time, distance grew between them. Then they learned about the 6 p.m. watch. Instead of arriving home and immediately discussing problems, they began setting aside 10 minutes together at 6 p.m. They would pray, even briefly. They would thank God for the day. They would ask for peace in their home. They would consciously close every door to strife before eating dinner. The first week, the difference was small but noticeable. Arguments still attempted to surface, but they did not escalate as before. By the third week, the atmosphere in their home shifted significantly. The predictable evening explosion stopped. It was not because they had fewer challenges. It was because they sealed the gate before darkness could widen it. That is how timing works. It does not eliminate all difficulty, it limits access. Let me speak plainly to you about fatigue. Darkness counts on it. Around 3 p.m., mental energy dips for many people. Around 9 or 10 p.m., spiritual alertness declines sharply. Between 2 and 4 a.m., physical vulnerability is high. These are natural rhythms of the human body. There is nothing sinful about them. But when a believer chooses to interrupt one of those vulnerable windows intentionally, even occasionally, it sends a signal in the spirit realm. At 3 a.m., when you rise to pray while fasting, you are declaring that sleep does not control you. At 6 a.m., when you align your day before it unfolds, you are declaring that circumstances will not dictate your direction. At Talat, noon, when you confront covenants in the brightest hour of the day, you are declaring that hidden agreements have no permanent shelter. At 3 p.m., when you appeal to heaven as verdict, you are refusing to accept accusations as final. At 6 p.m., when you seal your evening, you are closing gates before they are exploited. These are not dramatic gestures. They are disciplined ones. After my deliverance, I began counseling individuals who had experienced prolonged spiritual resistance. One man in Eldoret had battled repeated job loss. Each time he secured employment, it ended abruptly within months. He fasted frequently but without structure. Sometimes he skipped breakfast. Sometimes he prayed late at night. There was sincerity, but no alignment. We adjusted his approach. He began fasting 1 day a week and dedicating 6 a.m. to alignment prayer and 3 to verdict prayer. Nothing else changed initially. Within 4 months, he secured a position that remained stable. For the first time in years, termination did not occur. When challenges arose in the workplace, he addressed them at 3 p.m. consistently, appealing against every negative report and speaking stability over his employment. Was it magic? No, it was positioning. I also need to speak about something else that may be uncomfortable. Not every believer will have the same capacity. Some of you work night shifts. Some of you care for infants. Some of you have health limitations. This is not about legalism. It is about intentionality. If 3:00 a.m. is impossible daily, it may be possible once a week. If 12 noon is occupied by work, you may use a short break intentionally rather than casually scrolling through your phone. Heaven responds to clarity of intention. Inside the coven, we tracked consistency more than intensity. A believer who prayed loudly for 2 hours once a month was less threatening than one who prayed quietly for 15 minutes at the same watch every week. Predictable alignment created reinforcement structures in the spirit realm. We could not easily penetrate them. Consistency builds what you might think of as spiritual infrastructure. It is like reinforcing a building gradually. Each aligned watch strengthens the structure. I remember a university student in Arusha who struggled with persistent anxiety attacks. They often surfaced around midnight. She would wake suddenly with fear and racing thoughts. She assumed it was purely psychological. While there were natural components, there was also spiritual exploitation of that vulnerable hour. Instead of focusing only on midnight, we adjusted her evening watch. She began fasting once a week and closing her day intentionally at 6 p.m., praying specifically over her sleep and declaring peace. Within weeks, midnight disturbances reduced dramatically. She had strengthened the gate before night fully settled. You see, darkness prefers believers who are unaware, not ignorant in general, but unaware of timing. When you do not understand when transitions occur, you drift through them passively. But when you recognize them, you stand at the gate deliberately. Let me also tell you this. Timing does not replace faith. It supports it. Faith without structure can become inconsistent. Structure without faith becomes ritual. But when faith meets strategic timing, there is synergy. After years of using timing to harm, I now see how much damage occurred simply because believers lacked this understanding. Many had authority they never exercised at critical hours. Many had protection available they never activated. Not because they were unfaithful, but because no one explained the clock to them. You may ask yourself, if this is true, why does not everyone teach it? Sometimes truth remains hidden because it is practical rather than sensational. It requires discipline rather than emotion, and discipline is quieter than excitement. If you begin applying even one of these watches, do it with patience. Do not expect instant spectacle. Watch for subtle shifts for stability, where there was volatility, clarity, where there was confusion, peace, where there was agitation. These are signs that gates are adjusting. From the perspective I once had, I can tell you that when believers combined fasting with aligned watches consistently over months, entire assignments were abandoned, not delayed, abandoned. It was more efficient for darkness to redirect effort elsewhere than to keep colliding with reinforced boundaries. That is the kind of authority you are stepping into when you move with awareness. Not dramatic confrontation, but sustained resistance to intrusion. You do not need to fear darkness to apply this. Fear empowers the wrong side. Calm awareness strengthens the right one. If you choose one watch and honor it faithfully, you will begin to notice patterns shifting. And as you notice those shifts, you will understand something I learned from the opposite side. Heaven's timing is not random, it is precise. When you align yourself with it, you are not begging for breakthrough. You are stepping into a flow that was already scheduled. The more I live in freedom, the more I appreciate simplicity. Wake, align. Midday, expose. Afternoon, appeal. Evening, seal. Occasionally rise before dawn and occupy authority. It is not complicated. It is disciplined, and disciplined believers, more than emotional ones, were always the most difficult to overcome. Now I want to bring all of this together in a way that is steady and practical for you. When you hear about these 5 watches, 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 12 noon, 3 end a lot, and 6 p.m. it can feel like a lot. You may think, how can I possibly manage all of that? I understand that reaction. Discipline should strengthen you, not overwhelm you. The goal is not to fill your day with pressure. The goal is to introduce alignment. From where I once stood, observing believers carefully, the greatest advantage darkness had was not power. It was predictability. Most people lived spiritually on autopilot. They prayed when they felt inspired. They fasted when they felt desperate. They reacted to problems after they surfaced. That rhythm made them manageable. But when someone became intentional about timing, everything changed. Even if their prayers were simple, the fact that they were aligned with strategic hours created reinforcement around them. That reinforcement did not always show immediately invisible miracles. Often, it appeared first as stability, stability in finances, stability in health, stability in relationships. Crises that would have escalated instead dissolved quietly. I want you to consider your own life honestly. Where do you see repeating patterns? Is there a certain time of day when discouragement hits you more heavily? Is there a predictable window when conflict tends to surface in your home? Is there a particular hour when anxiety rises or temptation becomes stronger? Those patterns are not random. They are often tied to unguarded transitions. When you begin to place even a small marker in those hours, you disrupt cycles. It does not require shouting. It does not require dramatics. It requires presence. After my deliverance, I made a commitment to test everything I had known from the other side. I began with 6 a.m. That hour had always been significant in our operations because it set the tone for the day. When I started aligning myself intentionally at that time, even in quiet prayer, I noticed clarity in decisions that used to confuse me. Conversations that might have derailed became constructive instead. It was not because life became easier overnight. It was because I was no longer entering the day passively. Then I added 6 p.m. as a closing watch. For years, evening had been a preparation window for night operations. I understood how much vulnerability existed there. When I began sealing my evenings intentionally, peace over my sleep increased. The sense of spiritual turbulence that used to surface at night diminished. I was not reacting anymore. I was preempting. This is how you approach it gradually and consistently. There is something else you need to understand. Darkness depends heavily on agreement. Not always conscious agreement, but emotional and mental alignment. When a person repeatedly thinks, "This always happens to me," that thought becomes a reinforcement structure. When someone says, "I guess I will never break out of this cycle," that resignation creates permission. The watches interrupt agreement. At 3 p.m., when you appeal against accusations, you refuse mental consent to defeat. At 12 noon, when you address covenants, you refuse inherited limitations. At 3 a.m., when you rise, you refuse passivity. At 6 a.m., you refuse disorder. At 6 of war, unseal transitions. You are not fighting endlessly. You are closing doors methodically. I remember a businessman in Kigali who had experienced 3 sudden partnership betrayals. Each time the pattern was similar. A trusted associate would gain access to financial structures and then withdraw funds unexpectedly, leaving damage behind. He fasted often, but mostly in response to crisis. By the time he prayed intensely, the loss had already occurred. We adjusted his pattern. He began fasting 1 day a week and using 12 noon specifically to pray against hidden agreements and unauthorized access. He would speak clearly that every concealed intention in his partnerships be exposed before harm could occur. Within months, 2 potential partners revealed dishonesty early in negotiations before contracts were signed. Loss was avoided rather than repaired. That is what alignment does. It moves intervention earlier in the process. Another woman in Nairobi struggled with persistent evening depression. The wake would descend around sunset almost daily. She assumed it was simply emotional exhaustion. While there were natural components, there was also spiritual exploitation of that transition. We positioned her to use 6 p.m. as a deliberate gratitude and sealing watch. She began thanking God for specific things before night settled. She declared peace intentionally over her mind. Within weeks, the heaviness reduced significantly. The predictable descent no longer held the same power. Consistency matters more than intensity. Let me repeat that carefully. Consistency matters more than intensity. Darkness fears sustained alignment more than occasional passion. If you attempt to occupy all 5 watches immediately and exhaust yourself, you will likely stop. But if you choose one to honor it faithfully, you build infrastructure. Once that infrastructure stabilizes, you can add another without strain. Think of it as constructing a building. You do not pour all the concrete in 1 hour. You lay foundation first, then framework, then reinforcement. Over time, the structure stands firm. From my years studying believers, I can tell you something with calm certainty. Informed believers were not easier to attack, they were avoided. Darkness prefers open gates, not reinforced ones. If an assignment repeatedly fails at a certain address, it is redirected elsewhere. Efficiency governs operations on both sides. Now I want you to remove fear from this entirely. This is not about becoming obsessed with spiritual warfare. It is about becoming disciplined with spiritual rhythm. Fear destabilizes. Discipline steadies. When you wake tomorrow, you do not need to do something dramatic. If 6 till a.m. is possible, begin there. Sit quietly. Align your day. If 12 till noon is accessible, take 10 minutes and address anything hidden. If 3 p.m. finds you fatigued, whisper a brief appeal against every accusation forming. If 6 p.m. comes and you are tired, close your day intentionally before it closes you. And occasionally, if you feel led and able, rise at trinity, not to prove something, not to impress anyone, simply to stand in authority when darkness expects silence. Over time, you will notice something subtle but significant. You will stop feeling like you are constantly recovering from damage. Instead, you will feel like you are preventing it. That shift alone changes your sense of stability. I once coordinated attacks based on the assumption that most believers would never understand timing. Now I share this because I know what happens when they do. Plans unravel quietly. Access diminishes. Patterns weaken. Not always with spectacle, but with steady erosion. You do not need special titles. You do not need public recognition. You need awareness and consistency. The clock of heaven moves whether you acknowledge it or not. The question is whether you choose to move with it. When you do, you are not chasing breakthrough. You are positioning yourself where authority is already flowing. If you have fasted for years without seeing lasting results, do not assume your effort was wasted. It may simply have lacked alignment. If you have prayed faithfully and felt resistance intensify, do not assume you were failing. You may have been strong but mistimed. Timing is not everything, but it is significant. As I look back on the years I spent inside darkness, I see clearly now that heaven was never weak. Believers were often unaware. Once awareness comes, responsibility follows, but so does empowerment. You are not helpless. You are not at the mercy of random cycles. You have structure available to you. Wake and align. Midday, expose. Afternoon, appeal. Evening, seal. Occasionally, rise before dawn and stand. Do it calmly. Do it consistently. Let discipline replace reaction. And over time, you will notice that what once seemed immovable begins to shift, not because you fought harder, but because you moved wiser.